Before I start the podcast, I am once again asking for you to send me ideas for future episodes or even record your voice and send it in as a voice memo to be featured on an upcoming podcast. So if you're interested, go to the show notes here. You can email me. My email is sam@mcatbasics.com. You can follow the link in the show notes if you want to record your voice. But I would love to hear from anybody and everybody. Let me know if you have any ideas for future topics, interviews you want to hear, etc. Thanks.
Welcome to the MCAT Basics Podcast, brought to you by the physicians at Med School Coach. Each week, Sam Smith breaks down high-yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello and welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Basics with your host, Sam Smith. The goal of this podcast is to cover the highest yield topics on the MCAT and provide you with some sort of insight into the questions that the MCAT really likes to ask. This podcast covers social institutions. I'm going to talk about the big 5 social institutions: health and medicine, education, family, religion, and finally government. And I'll also say that this episode is pretty information dense. There's going to be a lot of definitions, a lot of vocab to know, and a lot of examples. Now, this information is going to show up on one of the 4 MCAT sections, that is the Psych-Soc section. As always, I hope you find this podcast helpful in your studies, and good luck to those of you who are taking the MCAT soon. So as I said, I'm really going to focus on kind of the big 5 social institutions in this podcast. But of course, I first want to define what a social institution is. So that way, once I get into those specific examples, you kind of know a little bit more what I'm talking about. So I'll define institution and then define social institution. An institution is defined as an organization or other formal structure that governs a field of action. With that said then, a social institution is defined by Jonathan Turner as, quote, a complex of positions, roles, norms, and values lodged in particular types of social structures and organizing relatively stable patterns of human activity with respect to fundamental problems in producing life-sustaining resources, in reproducing individuals, and in sustaining viable societal structures within a given environment, end quote. So that's obviously kind of a complex definition. Also, sorry, Ms. Gomez, my 4th grade teacher. I apologize directly to her because that is the longest run-on sentence I've ever seen. But what I want to do is kind of break that down a little bit further and kind of put this in more normal human terms. Okay, so essentially what this definition is saying is that social institutions are often organizations, and they're often transgenerational, meaning that they last through multiple generations. And then finally, it's saying that they lie somewhere in between these less complicated conventions, rules, social norms, etc., and the more complicated social entities like whole societies or whole cultures. So they're somewhere in between like these social norms and these societies or massive cultures. In general, social institutions have 2 main components. They have a structure and they have a function. So the structure of a social institution is, the people that make it up, the buildings, the hierarchy, etc. It also contains the different roles people play within the institution. And then the function of a social institution is exactly what it sounds like. It's the purpose it serves within society. So as I go through the big 5 social institutions to know for the MCAT, I'll talk about their structure as well as their function. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention that institutions, including social institutions, can either be formal or informal. Formal institutions are those created with the intention of governing human behavior. Government is kind of the key word there. And informal institutions are those that are not designed to regulate conduct, but often end up doing so as members seek to conform to communal standards. Examples of informal institutions include things like church. Right? Church has no legal grounds in regulating conduct, but it often ends up doing that because, the community, the church community, tries to conform to community standards or church standards. So as I mentioned in the intro, there are 5 different social institutions to know about on the MCAT. The first is health and medicine, The second is education. The third is family. The fourth is religion. And the fifth is government and economy. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over each of these individually. I will talk about the structure and the function of each of these. And then I'll talk about some vocab and concepts that are unique to each that you should know for the MCAT. I'll start with health and medicine. So, the structure of medicine and healthcare is something that we're probably all fairly familiar with. There is a physical structure to the healthcare system, that's hospitals, private doctors' offices, surgery centers, etc. And then there are also many different people and many different roles for people within healthcare. There's nurses, physicians, pharmacists, PAs, technicians, janitorial staff, billing departments, administration, and I could go on and on and on and on. There's many different roles. And these roles are kind of related to each other hierarchically. For example, administrative staff is usually, on top, and then you have doctors that are in charge of healthcare teams. Underneath them are PAs, then nurses, then technicians, and then, billing department maybe, and then janitorial staff. And then on the very, very, very bottom, you have scribes. Just kidding. Don't be mad at me. That's only a joke. Scribes are very important parts of hospitals. I know that. And I know that half the people listening to this are probably scribes. So again, I'm joking. Anyways, now in terms of the function of healthcare and medicine, that is in treating illness and promoting health. And I think there is a role in terms of employment. I'm not sure the number, and in fact, I'm going to look it up right after this. But what is the number of individuals in the U.S., or I guess what percent of the U.S. population is employed in some kind of healthcare job? If I had to guess, I would say somewhere in like the 20% range. I'm going to look it up right now. So it turns out I'm a little bit off, but not that much off. According to the Census Bureau, in the US, more than 20 million people are employed by the healthcare system. That's about 10% of employed individuals are working in the healthcare system. And that doesn't seem like a huge number, but that is the single most number or amount of people in any single sector in the US. And so that kind of goes back to my point here, which is that one of the functions, and it's probably more of like a latent function of the healthcare system, is in employing people, right? This is how a lot of people make a living. All right, so that is the structure as well as the function of healthcare and medicine. I want to talk now about a few terms that you should know regarding health and medicine. The first is medicalization. The second is the sick role. The third is more of a concept, and that is delivery of healthcare. The fourth is the illness experience, again, another concept. And then finally, I'll talk about social epidemiology. I'll start with medicalization. Medicalization can be defined as, quote, the process by which some aspects of human life come to be considered as medical problems, whereas before they were not considered pathological, end quote. One example I came across that I thought was pretty interesting is how shyness became a medical disorder. Apparently, by 1993, shyness was elevated to the third most common mental disorder in the United States after depression and alcoholism. And according to this article I was reading, antidepressants were actually prescribed to treat shyness. So that's medicalization. That's turning something that's not necessarily a problem or something that's not, seen as a medical issue, shyness, into something that is seen as a medical issue, and then using medicines to treat that medical issue. Now, according to an article by the Harvard Gazette, it's by Harvard, so you know it's legit, medicalization is not necessarily a bad thing. It says that, quote, but there is another good side to medicalization, the promise of new research and therapies for neglected diseases. Alzheimer's, he offered, was once just dismissed as senilism, end quote. So just kind of keep in mind that medicalization doesn't have to be just a negative or bad thing, right? Because as this article was saying, at one time, Alzheimer's was just looked at as like being a normal process. So just keep that in mind. Again, medicalization, not always bad. All right, moving on to what's called the sick role. The sick role is an idea that was developed by a very famous sociologist called Talcott Parsons. He was a functionalist. Now, this term, the sick role, is a term used in medical sociology regarding sickness and the rights and obligations of those who are affected by sickness. Basically, it says that a sick individual takes on a specific role, the role of being sick. And this role comes with values and norms. According to Parsons, sick people have rights as well as obligations. The rights they have are that they are temporarily exempt from performing normal social roles, things like going to work or housekeeping, and that the more severe the person's sickness is, the greater this type of exemption. So that's one of the rights they have. In terms of obligations, the sick person is expected to see being sick is undesirable, and so they're expected to work towards getting healthy in any way that they can. Also, after a certain period of time, the sick person must seek technically competent help, usually a doctor, and cooperate with the advice of a doctor in order to get better. So again, the sick role just talks about kind of the role that a person being sick takes on. And interestingly enough, Parsons actually saw illness as a deviance because when you're ill, you can't really contribute to society. And he went on to argue that people's entry into the sick role should be tightly regulated by doctors. He essentially said that there are people that are going to try to use the sick role to get out of doing things. And so the doctor must be able to tell when people are sick versus when they're not. Thus, they're kind of like the gatekeepers of the sick role. The overall takeaway, I think, for the sick role is that it describes the role that sick individuals take on. And according to Parsons, this role comes with unique responsibilities as well as unique rights. And when Parsons says this, I kind of see his point, right? Where else in society is it not looked upon badly if someone does nothing but lay in bed all day? Think back to like middle school. What other reasons were there for you to stay home from school? I remember being sick was like the biggest reason, right? Person X called in sick today, they're not going to be there. That was kind of the most common reason for staying home, and that was legit. Next, let me quickly mention the delivery of healthcare. So, how healthcare is delivered to patients is the delivery of healthcare. If you've done any shadowing, you probably have a little bit of a sense of this. Healthcare can be delivered in the inpatient setting, like in a hospital, or an outpatient setting, out of a hospital. It can be delivered in clinics, community centers, local offices. People can come into your own home. Travel nurses, travel doctors will go into people's homes. And in the US, especially for non emergent care, typically you go to a primary care provider who is kind of the home base for healthcare, and they'll refer you out to specialists. They will manage chronic conditions, they'll prescribe medications, do kind of the quarterbacking of your health. So that's delivery of healthcare. The next thing I want to talk about here is the illness experience. So, the illness experience is a term that describes how people behave when they're ill. And typically, this is used to look at people's behavior when they are chronically ill. To see what I mean by this, take for example a person who breaks their arm skateboarding. They'd expect to be in a cast for maybe a few months, and then everything's going to go back to normal and they're going to be able to live their life. In contrast to that, what happens when someone is diagnosed with a chronic disease like diabetes? How is that going to change their behavior, their attitude, and their feelings? Well, according to an article by Pamela Larson called The Illness Experience, when someone is diagnosed with a chronic disease, quote, the individual in the family develop their own meanings and perceptions of the condition and ultimately their own unique illness behaviors, end quote. These unique behaviors include things like loss of self, sorrow, devaluation of self, as well as closer ties to family. So, in short, to kind of summarize that all, illness affects people in different ways and can cause them to actually change their behavior and their attitude. And that is what's called the illness experience. Again, when someone breaks their arm, their attitude towards that is going to be more of a, I'm going to be okay. Eventually, I will get back to normal. But then when someone's diagnosed with a chronic disease, that can cause much more major changes in their attitude. And it can be very tough for them because that's something that's not just going to go away. It's going to be with them the rest of their life, in most cases. All right, the final concept I want to cover here in the healthcare and medicine social institutions section of the podcast is social epidemiology. So, social epidemiology is a branch of epidemiology that studies how social conditions impact health. This kind of looks at the social determinants of health, which, of course, is a very hot topic within medicine, as it should be. As an example of what social epidemiology is, take, for example, the study of HIV/AIDS. So, epidemiology in general would study the incidence, prevalence, transmission, as well as the outcomes of HIV infected individuals, and it would suggest ways to decrease the incidence, decrease the transmission, and improve outcomes. Now, social epidemiology would do all of those same things, only through the lens of social conditions. So, for example, it would look at how poverty status or race and ethnicity affect the incidence, prevalence, and transmission of HIV/AIDS. For example, in a paper called Epidemiology of HIV Infection in the United States, Implications for Linkage to Care by an author called Richard D. Moore, quote, while Black individuals account for 12% of the United States population, they represent 46% of all individuals living with HIV in the United States in 2006, end quote. So that statement right there is looking through a social lens at epidemiology. That's social epidemiology. And of course, the paper goes on to talk about why this disparity exists and what can be done to fix it. All right, so to summarize social epidemiology in a sentence, basically, social epidemiology investigates disease through looking at the social determinants of health. All right, so that is the social institution of health and medicine. The next social institution I'm going to talk about is education. I know they say nothing is ever free, but this is literally free. Now, let me explain. So, as a competition for work, I can receive $1 for every lead, which is an email and a name, that I generate, and that's up to $500. Now, this money is going to be given to me in the form of an Amazon gift card. However, I know what it's like to be a broke college student trying to study for the MCAT, so I want to pass this money on to one of you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to raffle off the Amazon gift card I received from the competition. This could be up to $500 if at least 500 people register for the giveaway. But if 10 people register, that's going to be $10. If 20 people register, that's going to be $20, and so on and so forth. So if you want to sign up for this giveaway, go to the show notes for this podcast, follow the link, enter your first, last name, and email, and you'll be entered. It's that easy. The deadline to enter is Wednesday, April 14th, so sign up soon. All right, let's talk about education. In terms of the structure of education, there are physical structures. That's things like elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, colleges, universities, technical schools. There's a lot of different physical structures that go along with education. And there's also people that are needed in the education system. You need teachers, you need administrators, you need school nurses, you need janitorial staff, you need people to maintain the physical structures. You need a lot of different people. In terms of hierarchy, there is definitely a hierarchy in the school system, just in terms of educational level, right? You go from primary school, which is called elementary school in the US, you go to middle school, and then secondary school, which is also called high school. And then afterwards, some people decide to do some type of post-secondary education. Some might get their associate's degree, others their master's, and even others, hopefully you, their doctoral degree. And I'll also mention that teachers become more and more and more specialized as you move up the educational ladder, right? In primary school, you have a single teacher who teaches a single subject. And then in middle school, you might have a teacher that teaches two subjects. And then in high school, you have a teacher that teaches a single subject, and same with college. Now, in terms of the function of education, the number one and probably easiest function to understand is that it educates people. Another one is that it socializes people. I think that that's part of, the curriculum, and I'll get a little more into what's called the hidden curriculum, but that's part of the hidden curriculum is that it socializes people. And then finally, one that you might not think about, but that's true, is in providing childcare. We've seen throughout the COVID pandemic that adults not having access to childcare is very difficult, right? There's a lot of households in the United States that are two-worker households where both parents work. So to try to manage kids as well as do your job is just very difficult, especially when your job can't be done from home. And so by sending children off to school, it really allows people to be able to go to work and not have to worry about what they're going to do with their kids. So again, kind of one of the hidden roles of education is in childcare. All right, now there are a few vocab slash concept terms that I'm going to go through here about education. The first is hidden curriculum. I kind of mentioned this already. I'll talk next about educational segregation and stratification. And then finally, I'll talk about teacher expectancy. So, hidden curriculum is the first term I want to discuss here. I mentioned this a little bit, but basically, on the surface, the purpose of school is to learn about science, math, history, English, art, all the different subjects you learn about. But there is also a hidden curriculum. And the hidden curriculum kind of looks at some of the more informal or unintended purposes of school. Things like the development of social skills, things like the transmission of norms and values, and things like providing childcare. And I think social skills is kind of one of the biggest parts of the hidden curriculum. Think about kids who you knew that were homeschooled. And I don't mean to, you know, be mean to people who are homeschooled, but in my own personal experience, the kids that I knew who were homeschooled did not quite have the same social skills as the kids who were not homeschooled. And I think that has a lot to do with just being around people every day and learning the social norms and social values that other people have and learning about how to interact with others. Now, one last thing I'll mention here is that conflict theory would suggest that part of the hidden curriculum of schools is in maintaining social inequality. A conflict theorist would say that school educates people based on their socioeconomic status and therefore maintains people's overall socioeconomic status and kind of limits them from moving up. And that kind of brings me to the next thing I want to talk about here regarding education, and that is educational segregation and stratification. Now, these two terms, educational segregation and educational stratification, are easily confused. They mean two different things. They're related, but again, they're different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you examples of each of these, and hopefully you can see the differences as well as the similarities between them. I'll start with educational segregation. So this has to do with actually physically separating kids. So, for example, it's just a fact that in some areas, minority students are concentrated in lower achieving schools, while non-minority students, a lot of times, are concentrated in better, higher achieving schools. In other words, minority students are segregated to these low performing schools and might not be given opportunities that other students would get, at a better performing school. Now, why is this the case? Well, I'm sure there is a million reasons why this is the case, but one of those reasons is that there is a correlation between housing prices and school quality. On average, higher performing schools tend to be in more affluent areas, which are disproportionately non-minority. So that's educational segregation. On the other hand, educational stratification has to do with students being stratified based upon their academic achievement at some point in time. Now, based on some research, academic achievement at a very young age correlates pretty highly with socioeconomic status. So, an example of how students can be educationally stratified comes in the form of gifted and talented programs. According to Jason Grisson of the Vanderbilt College of Education, quote, a student from a family in the top 20% of socioeconomic status is more than 6 times more likely to receive gifted services than a student in the bottom 20%, end quote. So, because of this, students with a higher socioeconomic status, again, more likely to put into these gifted and talented programs at a younger age, which then goes on to affect them really throughout their whole educational experience and well on into their lives. And some people argue that this exacerbates as well as perpetuates existing social stratifications. So again, educational stratification has to do with stratifying kids at a young age that goes on to affect their whole educational experience and really their life. Now, just to kind of summarize all this, let me give you the definition of educational segregation versus stratification. Educational segregation is separating students physically into high and low achieving schools based upon their socioeconomic status, which may correlate with the neighborhood that they live in. On the other hand, educational stratification is separating students not necessarily physically, by their academic achievement at a young age that some people argue perpetuates existing inequality. All right, the next term I want to talk about here is called teacher expectancy. Teacher expectancy, or the teacher expectancy effect, is where a teacher's expectations of a student's academic performance influences the student's actual performance. For example, a teacher may provide more positive feedback and or attention to a student that they think has greater potential than to a student that they think has lower potential. And this positive feedback and attention then has the potential to increase the performance of that student. Thus, teacher expectancy is kind of like this feedback loop where the teacher expects more from a particular student, thus, they give that student more attention, and thus, they get more from that student. And this, by the way, can be completely unconscious by the teacher. All right, so that is education. The next social institution I'm going to talk about here is family. I'll start by talking about the structure of family. According to an article in the Journal of Family Issues, the traditional family structure is two parents providing care and support for their biological offspring. Now, of course, that article was written in the 1960s, and our idea of what a family is has really changed since then. The family structure is now becoming less and less homogenous and more diverse, right? It can be a single parent with children, it can be two people with no children, it can be two people of the same gender with or without children. There's just so many different forms of what we consider family. And I think the takeaway point here is that there's not just one family structure, right? There are many, many, many different types of family structure that exist. In terms of the function of family, it offers the regulation of sexual activity. Reproduction is one big function. It socializes and supports children, offers companionship, and finally, it helps produce successful members of society. So that's kind of the general structure and function of family. There are a few concepts and vocab words you got to know here. The first of which is forms of kinship. I'll talk about diversity in family forms. I kind of mentioned this already. And then finally, I'll talk about violence in the family. So first off, what is kinship? To me, it kind of sounds like an old-timey way of saying family. Typically, though, kinship is relationships between people who have some family tie. And there are three different forms or types of kinship. The first is called consanguineal, the second is affinal, and the third is fictive. Consanguineal relatives are people on both sides of your family that are related to you by blood. So this is family on your father's side and family on your mother's side. That includes things like grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, etc. Affinal relatives are people who are related to you via marriage. So this is things like your brother-in-law, your mother-in-law, basically any in-law is an affinal relative. And as a little bit of an aside, where does this term come from, in-law? I was kind of curious. Apparently, there is a long tradition of calling people who are related to you via marriage as in-laws. And it all goes back to the 14th century. The idea behind it was originally that your mother-in-law has the same rights and duties as your biological mother and is given these rights and duties by the legal pact of marriage. Thus, they are your mother-in-law. With that said, the third type of kinship is called fictive kinship. This is kin-like relationships that are not based upon blood or marriage. Examples include things like godparents, adopted children, and really good friends that we call brother or sister. Another example is like my parents have really good friends that I call either aunt or uncle, even though they are not related to me by blood. That's another example of fictive kinship. So that's kinship and types of kinship. The next thing I'm going to talk about here is diversity in family forms. I kind of talked about this earlier, but really the MCAT just wants you to be aware that families can take on multiple forms. It can be, for example, a heterosexual relationship with biological children. It can be two men married, two women married with an adopted child. It can be a heterosexual relationship with adopted child. It can be a single person with adopted child. The list goes on and on and on and on. And then in some cultures, things like polygamy are okay. That's where a person has multiple husbands or multiple wives. This, of course, is taboo in the US, but that's not true for all places in all cultures. The last thing that the MCAT wants you to know about the social institution of family has to do with violence in the family. So I think one big thing to consider here is that everyone in a family can experience violence. It can be grandparents, it can be children, it can be women, it can be men. It's everybody. With that said, though, women, children, and the elderly are particularly vulnerable to violence in the family. Further, substance abuse disorders, alcohol abuse especially, can increase the risk of family violence. And not to spoil one of the MCAT exams for you, but I think there was a question, at least that I recall, that was on one of the practice exams or some type of AAMC material that was talking about violence in the family and was kind of hitting at the point that violence can be experienced by everyone in the family. So I think that right there should be kind of the biggest takeaway is that, no one is exempt from violence in the family. The next social institution I'm going to talk about here is religion. Now, religion, like all the other ones that I've talked about, has some physical structure, right? There are churches, there are synagogues, mosques. Really, any religion has some type of physical building that goes with it. On top of that, there is typically a hierarchical structure of the leaders of a church. For example, in Christianity, that is a priest or a pastor. In Judaism, that's a rabbi. There's usually some type of leader, and then there are other positions within the church that do lower level tasks and are under the priest or rabbi. Now, religion serves many different purposes. It gives people a purpose, it creates community, and some argue that it gives people a moral compass. Now, there are three different terms or concepts that you should know regarding religion. The first is a term called religiosity. The second is that you should know three different types of religious organizations: churches, sects, and cults. And finally, you should know a little bit about religion and social change. I'll start with the term religiosity. So, religiosity is used to describe how religious a person or society is. For example, a person who goes to church weekly, maybe reads their Bible every morning and prays regularly, has a high degree of religiosity. Compare that to someone who maybe goes to church once a year and questions their beliefs, they would have relatively lower religiosity. With that said, the term religiosity can also be applied to society. For example, in the US, religiosity has been on the decline since the 1960s. For example, since the 60s, the number of Americans that self-report as being affiliated with some religion has dropped from 95% to about 75%. That's a decrease in religiosity of the US. The next thing you should know here is the difference between churches, sects, and cults. And by the way, all the information that I am about to speak about comes from the University of Minnesota Library open source material. So thank you to them. All right, so a church is a large, bureaucratically organized religious organization that is closely integrated into larger society. In some societies, the church is even connected to the state. For example, Islam in some Middle Eastern nations. And then in some societies, like the United States, churches are separate from the state. So that's a church. A sect is a relatively small religious organization that is not closely integrated into the larger society and often conflicts with at least some of the norms and values of the society. And typically, sects form as a breakaway from a church. Examples of this include the Amish, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormonism. And finally, a cult is a small religious organization that is at great odds with the norms and values of larger society. Cults are somewhat similar to sects, but differ in a few major ways. I'll point out three of the ways that they're different. Number one, they generally have not broken away from a larger church. Instead, cults originate outside of the mainstream religious tradition. There are some exceptions to that, obviously, as there are religious cults. There's an interesting podcast called Mommy Doomsday. It's a true crime podcast about this woman named Lori Vallow, who is part of the Mormon church. She breaks away, creates a cult where they believe that some people are zombies and that the end times are near. And they end up doing some pretty horrible things, including allegedly killing their own children. So that is an example of a cult that has broken away from a church or from a sect. So, the second thing that distinguishes a cult from a sect is that cults are often secretive and do not attempt to convert people as much as a sect does. The third difference is that cults typically rely on some charismatic leader that can speak well or has some type of personal qualities that people really adore and makes them want to follow that leader. Okay, finally, you should know about religion and social change. There is three terms here to know: secularization, modernization, and fundamentalism. I'll start with secularization because it ties pretty closely into modernization. So, secularization is the transformation of a society from close identification with religious values and institutions towards non religious values and secular institutions. Basically, secularization means a society is moving away from religion. Now, with that said, secularization is seen to be part of modernization. Modernization is just the process where societies grow and age, and they, quote, modernize and change in predictable ways. And so, one of the predictable ways that societies age and modernize is, as I mentioned, by secularizing. Next, according to the Open Sociology Dictionary, fundamentalism is, quote, a religious movement that requires strict and typically literal interpretation of core texts and adherence to traditional beliefs, doctrines, and rituals, end quote. So, fundamentalism essentially opposes secularization and modernization. People continue to interpret religious texts literally, even though the morals and values of a society are changing around them. All right, so that is it for the social institution of religion. We have made it to the very final social institution I'm going to talk about. That is government and economy. Can't get into a hospital or doctor's office to do shadowing? Well, you're in luck. A fourth-year medical student and I just produced a virtual shadowing video series that is also a podcast. The idea here is to help pre-meds get some kind of clinical experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, since it's pretty hard to right now. I obviously have no idea how admissions committees are going to view this. I don't know what they're going to say if you put it on your med school application, but I imagine that it's only going to help and that it's better than nothing. Throughout the recording of the series, I learned a ton, and I think you would too. So if you're interested, search virtual shadowing in your podcast app or visit shadowing.medschoolcoach.com. All right, on to the very last social institution here, government and economy. Like most of these other social institutions, government has physical structure. There are local government buildings, state government buildings, federal government buildings, including things like the White House and the Capitol building. And further, each of these different levels of government, local, state, and federal, have kind of their own set of responsibilities, right? It's not necessarily a hierarchy. In some ways it is, in some ways it's not. Local government is going to take care of specific issues that the state is not, and then the state is going to take care of certain issues that the federal government is not. With that said, there's also a people structure to government. In this case, there is more of a strict hierarchy, right? For example, the attorney general of a state is the top legal officer of that state. They oversee the state's justice system, whereas at the local level, you have individual police officers enforcing laws that are part of that state's justice system. In terms of the function of government and economy, it maintains social stability, it makes and enforces rules, it meets social needs by providing a safety net for some of its citizens, it manages international relations, it oversees market and competition. A lot of times that's through antitrust law. And of course, depending upon an individual's political affiliation, the role of government and economy might be a little bit different. All right, there are three different concepts that you need to know regarding government and economy. The first is the difference between power and authority. The second is comparative economic and political systems. And the third is division of labor. I'll start with the difference between power and authority. So power is defined as an entity or individual's ability to control or direct others. On the other hand, authority refers to accepted power. This is basically power that people agree to follow. For example, elected officials in the United States have both power and authority because, for the most part, people accept the rule of that person, and more broadly, they accept the role of that institution. There are some notable exceptions. I'm not going to name any names, but for the most part, elected officials have authority in the United States. So again, the distinction between power and authority lies in the fact that authority is accepted power, basically power that people agree to follow. Now, on to comparative economic and political systems. There are many different types of economic and political systems that a government can have. Types of political systems is where I've seen this come up. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of go over some of the vocab that you might see. I'm going to talk about 5 different political systems: democracies, monarchies, dictatorships, theocracies, and totalitarianism/authoritarianism. Democracies are political systems where the citizens of the society have the power to vote for changes they want. Now, there are 2 different types of democracies. There are representative democracies and direct democracies. Representative democracies is where officials are elected by the citizens to then make decisions for the citizens. And then direct democracies are where people vote on everything. Every single decision that the government makes is voted upon by the citizens. This is obviously hard for a society to do that's as big as the US. Monarchies are where the power in the society belongs to a ruling family. They essentially claim that God has given them the right to rule over everybody. This is, of course, where kings and queens rule. And again, there are 2 different forms of monarchy. There are absolute monarchies and limited or constitutional monarchies. In an absolute monarchy, the rulers have total power over the government. The kings or the queens are just absolute rulers. On the other hand, in a limited monarchy, this is like the UK is now, the power of the monarchy is limited by a constitution and parliament. In this type of political system, citizens have much, much, much more power than they would in an absolute monarchy. And as I mentioned, the British monarchy is kind of an example of this, right? The king and the queen in Britain have no real power. They're just kind of like celebrities/figureheads. Next, dictatorships are when a nation is ruled by a single person. And in this case, the power that this leader has is usually taken by force and requires military support. A theocracy is government based upon religious law. Rulers are typically high-ranking members of a church. And then finally, totalitarianism/authoritarianism are systems where the leaders have full power over the citizens. Usually this power is taken by force. The word leaders is kind of the key word here because usually it's like a group of people who are the leaders in a totalitarianism/authoritarianism society or system. Finally, the very, very last thing I'll mention here is a term called division of labor. This term refers to the specialization of labor into very particular roles. And in a way, it kind of makes me think of like a car factory, right? Each person in the factory performs a very specific role. For example, one might make sure that the hubcaps are correctly installed. Another would make sure the gas tank is assembled properly. Another might work on painting the cars, and so on and so forth. Each individual in this factory has a very specific job, and that is division of labor. Another example that's probably a bit more salient for people who want to go into medicine is the fact that medicine is becoming more and more and more specialized. Less and less people are becoming general practitioners, and more are going into highly specialized fields. Finally, division of labor is associated with increases in output, whether that is in cars or in medical care, and is associated with capitalism. All right, so that is it for the Social Institutions podcast. I'm sorry if it was a bit boring and a bit long with lots of vocab, but that basically describes what PsychSoc is. So I hope you got something good out of it at least. As always, if you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us in the rankings and helps us reach more people. And, tell your friend or your cousin or your buddy who is just starting to study for the MCAT that there is this free resource out there that exists, if of course they like, learning in the audio format. And don't forget, send me an email, leave me a voice recording. Let me know what you guys want to hear. I'd really appreciate that. I've covered quite a bit of material, and I'm trying to kind of look at some other topics to cover that I have not yet covered for the MCAT. Good luck as you continue your studying, and I hope you do really well on the MCAT.
Each episode of MCAT Basics is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access Med School Coach services, including MCAT tutoring and medical school admissions advising, visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Good luck as you prepare for the MCAT, and we hope you tune in again next time.